I want a divorce. My husband beat our 28-year-old son just because he did something natural and human like cheating. He cannot react in such an exaggerated way. The day the judge declared my retirement savings would be used to replace my grandchildren's college money, I felt like my life was ripped from my hands. On the screen you could see the transfers from my son's account to mine, with my name and my numbers, while the expert repeated that it proved an attempt to hide funds. I was just thinking that all I had done was protect my son from the system, just as I had protected him his whole life from an overbearing father and a wife who never understood him. When I signed the paper that froze my accounts, the looks around me were of contempt, as if I were a criminal. No one put into context the years I ran the house, the sacrifices I made, the times I contained Rodrigo's anger so he wouldn't break anything. Suddenly, everything was reduced to those numbers in red and the label of accomplice that someone decided to put on me without seeing anything else. The most ironic thing is that all this started, according to them, because of an affair. Something I always considered human, natural, a part of life, and that only became a tragedy because Rodrigo decided to solve it with his fists. To understand how I ended up being the only one who lost everything, you have to start long before that courtroom full of papers and accusing faces. In my mind, my life with Rodrigo had always been solid, not perfect, but solid. 30-something years of marriage, a paid-off house, the Sunday routine, dinners with the kids, grandchildren running down the hall. He was always the rigid one, the one who saw the world in black and white, who measured everything in terms of duty and responsibility. I was the one who softened the edges, who said you didn't have to be so dramatic, that times had changed. For me, a mother's role was simple. Protect your children, even if it meant arguing with their father when he crossed the line. Diego, our youngest son, was always the most restless. He married young to Lorena, a proper, hard-working girl from a good family, but with the charm of a newly painted wall. Everything well-placed, everything in order, but zero spark. He used to say half-jokingly, half-seriously, that he'd married an accountant, not a woman. When he confessed to me, in one of those mother-son talks, that he had a special friend he saw from time to time, I didn't faint or preach to him. I told him to be careful, not to get anyone pregnant, not to mix his home life with his adventures. Deep down I thought a 28-year-old man, married so young, needed to breathe. I never told Rodrigo about the friend. I knew him too well. He would have turned it into an eternal moral judgment. He would have talked about values, principles, how in his day that wasn't done. I didn't want a war to break out at home over something that could be overlooked with a little discretion. As long as Diego fulfilled his duties as a father and provider, I saw no need to make a scene over something that's ultimately part of human nature. The day everything exploded was a Sunday like any other. It was 6 in the evening and I was in the kitchen making coffee and something sweet because Diego and Lorena were coming over with the kids. We had a habit of watching a movie or just talking, them on the couch, the kids throwing toys everywhere. In that routine I found peace, a kind of confirmation that we had done well as parents. I heard a thud in the living room, so loud that the cup vibrated in my hand. I thought one of the kids had dropped something, but then came a muffled scream, an adult's, not a child's. I left everything on the counter and ran. When I got there, I saw Diego on the floor with a bloody mouth, a hand on his face and his eyes wide open. Rodrigo's fist was still clenched, his chest heaving. Lorena was in a corner crying with her cell phone in her hand. The kids were peeking from the stairs. Scared, Rodrigo started shouting that Diego had emptied the grandchildren's savings. We had a fund in a joint account for the kids' university, for their future. He was showing me printed bank statements. He pointed to large amounts withdrawn in a few months. Lorena, between sobs, showed the phone with screenshots of chats, hotel reservations, transfers to a woman I didn't even know. They were talking about trips, gifts, nights in hotels we had never even stayed in. Rodrigo kept repeating that the money belonged to the children, that Diego had gambled with his own children's future. I saw all that, but what really stuck in my head was the image of my son on the floor bleeding. He was shaking, trying to get up, and Rodrigo faced him again with clenched fists. I didn't see a worried father, I saw an out-of-control man losing it in front of his grandchildren. I stood in front of Diego instinctively, spread my arms to act as a barrier and pushed Rodrigo back. I started screaming at him that he was an animal, how dare he raise his hand to his own son, that it was one thing to make a mistake and another to beat him up in front of everyone. While Rodrigo tried to explain the account movements to me, I barely looked at the papers. I only saw the swelling on Diego's face, the trickle of blood running down his chin, the children with fear-filled eyes. Rodrigo said it wasn't just an affair, that Diego had plundered almost the entire university fund in less than 6 months. Lorena confirmed it, saying she'd discovered the hotel reservations on the card, the restaurant charges, the gifts bought in another woman's name. Instead of getting caught up in the numbers, I felt my blood boil because of the way Rodrigo had reacted. In my mind, what Diego had done was irresponsible, yes, but within something I can understand. Infidelity exists, it has always existed. You can fool yourself with speeches, but men cheat, women cheat too, and families go on. What I couldn't accept was seeing my husband turn this situation into a violent spectacle. I yelled that he had no right, that a punch changes everything, that there are lines you don't cross, no matter how wrong your son is. I repeated that Diego was a human being with desires, not a monster. In the midst of the chaos, I felt something break inside me, not just because of the punch, but because of the coldness with which Rodrigo spoke of figures while our son was on the floor. I told him I didn't want to share a bed with someone capable of hitting like that from that moment on I wanted a divorce. I said it without mincing words. I made it clear I was on my son's side, that I wasn't going to side with a man who solves things with his fists. And with all my accumulated anger, I blurted out that phrase that set him off, that what Diego had done, making a mistake, getting carried away, was something natural, that Rodrigo was the one overreacting. I expected Rodrigo to explode, to scream, to defend himself, but no. He was silent for a few seconds, looked at me with a strange serenity, turned around and went to our room. I saw him open the dresser, take out folders, papers, the envelope where we kept important documents. When he came back, he had a set of papers in his hand that I recognized immediately. They were the insurance documents, the deeds, and in the middle, the marriage certificate and some divorce forms. He told me he'd had them ready for months just in case. He added that he wasn't going to wait for me to do to him what Diego had done to Lorena. I saw him sign the papers in front of me with a terrifying calm. He said that if destroying a home was natural to me, then he wouldn't stay tied to me for another minute. He packed his things without losing his composure, called a taxi, and brought a suitcase with my clothes to the hall. He informed me he was cutting all economic ties with me, that we'd each fend for ourselves. Lorena, with swollen eyes, just added that if I saw what Diego had done as so human, then I should stay with him. That same night, I slept on the sofa in Diego's small apartment. He had a bruise covering half his face and his wrapped in a towel and a lost look. I felt a knot in my chest, a mix of anger, wounded pride, and a sort of twisted satisfaction for having set a limit with Rodrigo. I kept telling myself I'd done the right thing by standing up to him, that I wouldn't let anyone mistreat my son that way. I didn't dwell too much on the figures that had been mentioned, or the grandchildren's fund, or the hotel reservations. For me, at that moment, everyone was being tremendously unfair to me for having chosen the side I was always clear about, my son's. Update 1. Settling into Diego's apartment was like entering a house after an earthquake. Everything was a mess. There were open boxes in the hallway, half-empty drawers, toys with missing pieces, photo frames without photos. Lorena had left with the kids to her parents' house the same day of the incident, taking the basics and leaving the rest half-packed. On the dining table there were 2 dirty cups and a couple of drawings by the kids, as if someone had been ripped from the scene in the middle of a normal Sunday. Diego walked around the place like a guest in his own life. His face was bruised, his lips split, and a mixture of shame and anger made him clench his jaw. Still, he didn't stop justifying himself. He said his lover made him feel alive, that with Lorena everything was routine, that he had married too young, and that nobody understood him. He kept repeating that the children's money could be recovered, that life has its ups and downs, that an opportunity to feel something like this doesn't come twice. I listened to him, and although some details made me uncomfortable, I generally understood what he was talking about. I started repeating his narrative almost without realizing it. When someone mentioned Lorena, I'd say she was a good mother, yes, but she never knew how to connect with Diego, that she turned everything into lists and plans, that no man can stand feeling scrutinized all the time. When the topic of the children's money came up, I'd reply that the grandparents would always be there to help the grandchildren, that a fund can be rebuilt, that the important thing was for Diego not to fall apart. I acted as a shield, as if I were the only rope holding him up. Lorena's divorce petition arrived quickly, like a cold slap. The document spoke of infidelity, misuse of family funds, instability. It asked for child support, custody, and what annoyed Diego the most, a complete financial audit. The paper stated verbatim that all accounts, all movements, all assets in their names during the marriage would be reviewed. I read that and felt the entire system was collapsing on him. His wife, his in-laws, his father, the lawyers, all against him. That's how I saw it. At the meeting with Diego's lawyer, things became even more concrete. The man talked about deadlines, experts, that Lorena had the right to know where every cent was, especially from the children's fund. Diego started to sweat, to bounce his knee nonstop. He confessed that he still had some money saved in a secondary account, from commissions and sales he'd never mentioned at home. He said if that came to light, they'd leave him on the street, that Lorena and her parents would squeeze him for every last cent. It was then that I came up with what in my head was a way to balance things. I thought that if the system always protected devoted wives and mothers, someone had to look out for the son who had made a mistake, but was still my own flesh and blood. I proposed that he transfer part of that money to one of my personal accounts, which were still active despite my divorce from Rodrigo. I told him it would only be until the storm passed, that once everything calmed down we could see what to do. I felt almost heroic, like those mothers who step in front of a bullet for their children. We organized the transfers to look natural. No huge movements at once, but several medium-sized amounts, spaced out, labeled as family help or reimbursement. Diego was still hesitant, but in the end he did it. With each transfer, I felt I was protecting him from an unfair system. I thought that if Rodrigo hadn't been so harsh, we wouldn't have had to resort to this. I justified every click as a way to fix what seemed to me an imbalance. I didn't see myself as someone hiding money, but as the mother who steps in when everyone is pointing in the same direction. As the transfers entered my account, I imagined Lorena reviewing papers with her lawyers and finding less than she expected. It comforted me to think that she wouldn't have absolute control over Diego's financial future, that some of his efforts were safe from that judgment that seemed excessive to me. I didn't consider for a second that those numbers moving from one screen to another would later become evidence against me. For me, at that moment, it was all simply about protecting my son from a world that was once again coming down on him too hard. Update 2. The day of the hearing where the audit reports were to be presented, I arrived thinking it would be just another formality in Diego and Lorena's divorce. I imagined lawyers arguing about percentages, about who got the car, about visitation schedules for the children. It never crossed my mind that my name would be the center of attention. I sat behind Diego with a folder in my hand and the normal nerves of any mother accompanying her son in court. When the financial expert entered with his briefcase and his computer, I didn't even pay much attention. At first, everything changed when they turned off the lights and turned on the big screen at the back. The expert began to explain in a completely neutral tone that he had reviewed the movements in Diego's accounts during the months before and after the divorce filing. He first showed the withdrawals from the Children's University Fund, one after another, on dates I vaguely remembered as the same months Diego was showing up with new gifts and plans. Then, almost without transition, the record of several transfers made from Diego's account to an account in my name appeared on the screen. Seeing my full name projected, with specific amounts next to it, was like having ice water thrown on me. The expert pointed out the dates and related them to the time Lorena had filed the lawsuit. He said it was significant that after the formal notification of the process, Diego had begun to move significant sums to his mother's account. He said it just like that, without emotion. But each word landed heavily. Lorena's lawyer took advantage of that explanation and asked the judge if I could clarify why a man about to face a lawsuit for misuse of his children's funds was sending not insignificant amounts of money to his newly divorced mother without any contract. I felt all eyes on me at the same time. I tried to say they were help, that Diego was paying me back money I had lent him in the past, that in our family we had always operated like that, without so much paperwork. I mumbled something about the difficult situation of my divorce from Rodrigo, about the need to reorganize my finances, about gestures of affection from a son to his mother. But each explanation sounded weaker than the last, especially when the judge intervened to use words much harsher and more technical than I was prepared to hear. Although I don't understand that language, it was clear what they meant when they started talking about an attempt to conceal assets and fraudulent conveyance. Suddenly, they were no longer just arguing about who got the house or the car, but about movements made with the intention of dodging the obligations Diego had to his wife and children, and there my name didn't appear as a spectator, but as an active participant. I felt like I was being dragged from the back row to sit next to the accused, even though no one physically moved a chair. Diego looked at me with a mixture of panic and reproach, as if he hadn't been the one who asked me for help crying, but me the one who had pushed him to touch the accounts. Lorena, on the other hand, looked at me with a kind of vengeful serenity, as if what she was seeing confirmed everything she already thought of me. Rodrigo's lawyer wasn't even there, but I imagined him satisfied because somehow that scene also validated his decision to cut all economic ties with me. I kept telling myself mentally that all this had originated in Rodrigo's exaggerated reaction, in his punch, in his inability to understand his own son. But in that room nobody seemed interested in the origin, only in what could be proven in numbers. When the judge decided it was necessary to open a separate criminal proceeding to study whether those transfers constituted attempted fraud, I felt the floor open up beneath me. I had no intention of becoming a criminal at this stage of my life. In my head, I had only been a mother trying to soften the blow of a system that was too harsh. But the reality of that day was that my last name was written on a pile of papers that spoke of concealment, of maneuvers, of shared responsibility. And what for me had been a gesture of protection began to take the form of a crime in their language. Update 3. The criminal proceedings moved forward with the speed that things never have when it comes to helping someone, and that strangely they do have when it comes to punishing. I was summoned several times to testify, to explain the origin of my funds, to detail what I had used Diego's money for. Every answer I gave, no matter how sincere, seemed to fit too well into the story they had already constructed. When I said I had used part of that money to support myself after my divorce from Rodrigo, they took notes as if I had just admitted something serious. If I mentioned that I had also paid some of Diego's bills, they interpreted it as confirmation that everything was related. By the time the sentence came, I was already exhausted, without even the strength to be angry. In the courtroom, the judge spoke confidently, as if the facts were indisputable. He said that the sums transferred from Diego's account to mine should be considered part of the couple's marital assets, and that my participation in those movements in the middle of a divorce process justified exemplary measures. He explained that to guarantee the restitution of the children's university fund and compensation to Lorena, my retirement and personal savings accounts would be seized. In a matter of weeks, the little I had accumulated after decades of domestic work, plus the contributions Rodrigo had made in my name for my retirement, became figures trapped in seizure orders. I didn't see bills, I didn't see checks, only notifications from the bank saying I no longer had access to my own money. My card stopped working at the supermarket, at the pharmacy, anywhere. The feeling of emptiness wasn't just in the account, it was also in my stomach and in my throat. Rodrigo, meanwhile, completely distanced himself, as if this were someone else's problem. He changed his number, stopped responding to any attempt to contact him. I found out through third parties that he had sold the house where we had lived for so many years and had moved to another city, far from the scandal, far from Diego, far from me. Some acquaintances said they understood him, that after everything that had happened, it was logical that he wanted to start over. No one seemed to remember that I had also cleaned, organized, and maintained that house for decades. My name didn't appear anywhere on paper, so my story didn't count either. My church friends, those with whom I had shared so many afternoons of tea and prayers, began to distance themselves. At first it was vague excuses for not getting together, then complete silence. One of them told me, in a tone of false gentleness, that people were saying I had helped my son steal from my own grandchildren. It didn't matter that that word had never left my mouth, or that I had never thought of things in those terms. That was the narrative that had taken hold, and there was no explanation that could counter it. I suddenly found myself without a husband, without a house, without savings, and with my name associated with a case of which people only remembered the simplest version. When I walked through the neighborhood, I felt the curtains move a little more than usual. At family gatherings, if I even found out about any, I noticed that the conversations changed topic when I arrived. I kept telling myself in private that all I had tried to do was correct an excess, defend my son from excessive violence and from a wife who didn't know how to handle his mistakes. But reality took it upon itself time and again to remind me that the only one paying the full price for all of this was me. Update 4. The following years were a kind of slow but steady decline. With my account seized and without Rodrigo's financial support, I had to take any job that came along. A distant cousin offered me a room in her house, a small one, with damp walls and a window overlooking an inner courtyard where other people's voices never stopped. In exchange for low rent, I helped her with cleaning and caring for her sick mother-in-law. I also started working by the hour cleaning other houses and caring for the elderly. None of this resembled the quiet retirement life I had imagined after so many years of marriage. Diego ended up signing an agreement with Lorena. He accepted a support payment he can barely afford, with direct deductions from his paycheck and supervised visits with the children in a neutral space. He works more hours than he should, takes whatever he can get, but he's always chasing debts that never seem to shrink. I see him arriving at the visits with his face marked by exhaustion, trying to feign joy so the children don't notice that everything around him is held together with pins. When he leaves, his face falls suddenly as if he's taking off a mask. The lover, that woman for whom it was supposedly worth risking so much, disappeared from the equation as soon as the trips, hotels, and expensive gifts ended. As soon as things got complicated, she stopped answering calls, blocked numbers, found someone who could keep up with the pace she wanted. Every time I hear that, a bitter feeling runs through me, not only for Diego, but because it confirms how unfair it is that in the end the real weight of all this has fallen on those who benefited the least from the story. My grandchildren grew up with a very specific version of what happened. For them, their father is the man who made a serious mistake and is now trying to repair the damage as best he can. And I am the grandmother who helped hide the money that was theirs. When I see them at birthdays they can't avoid being brought to, they greet me with distant politeness. There are no more running into my arms or shared stories. They sit far away, look at their phones, or talk among themselves as if I were an awkward figure to be tolerated for a while. No one bothers to explain the nuances or tell them that things weren't so simple. At family gatherings where we meet, I feel the stares on the back of my neck. Some people think I deserve it. Others just watch me like someone looking at an example of what not to do. The same phrases are repeated over and over, that a mother should correct her children, not cover for them, that a woman has to be impartial when it comes to her grandchildren, that motherly love cannot override the law. No one mentions that I also lost a marriage, a house, and an entire retirement in the process. It's as if only the damage that, according to them, I helped cause matters, not the damage I received. Working by the hour, counting every coin. I've had plenty of time to go over everything. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if on the day of the fight, instead of standing in front of Diego, I had sided with Rodrigo. If I had looked at the bank statements first and then the bruises, if instead of proposing transfers to my accounts I had said that everyone should deal with their own mess. But those questions always remain half-answered, because no matter how hard reality has hit me, deep down I still feel it was impossible for me to look at my son on the floor and not stand by his side. Now I live with just enough, with no room for unforeseen events, no financial cushion, and with a shattered reputation. When I get home at the end of the day and lie down in that bed that's not mine, in a room I never dreamed of, I tell myself that all I did was defend my son from a world that, for those who fail, has no mercy. The price I'm paying is disproportionate compared to what you see every day around me. There are so many men who have cheated, who have taken money, who have played with several lives at once and continue to walk around without anyone touching them. Mine had the bad luck of being singled out and judged, and I had the audacity not to let go of his hand. And for that, in the end, I was the only one left with nothing.